You're listening to The Global Front with Irada Hasan. When we say energy, what do we actually mean? It sounds technical, distant, something for engineers or politicians to discuss. But energy is simpler than that. It's your heating in winter, the price you pay at the gas station, the cost of groceries arriving at the supermarket. It's the quiet system running underneath everyday life. And yet, most of us rarely think about it until something changes. A price jumps, a conflict begins somewhere far away, and suddenly life feels more expensive. So why should you care about energy? Because energy is not just fuel, it's influence. It connects distant regions to your daily choices, whether you realize it or not. And once you see how those connections work, the world starts to look very different. Before sanctions, before speeches, before wars, there is energy. It doesn't arrive on television screens. It doesn't make headlines every day. But it decides which economies grow, which governments worry about winter, and which leaders pick up the phone first. Energy is one of the most effective levers of control in modern history for one simple reason. You cannot switch it off overnight. Military power is visible. Economic sanctions are announced, but energy dependency is built quietly, through pipelines laid decades earlier, through contracts signed by governments long gone, and once those connections exist, politics begins to flow along them. Energy is different from almost every other commodity. If wheat prices rise, consumers adjust. If technology becomes expensive, alternatives appear. But when energy becomes scarce or expensive, entire economies slow down. Factories pause, household bills rise, inflation spreads. And the impact is never local. Energy moves through every country, every market, and every layer of global society, from governments and industries to ordinary families paying monthly bills. The cost of energy shapes electricity prices, transport costs, food prices, and the competitiveness of entire economies. That is why energy is such a powerful lever of influence. It touches everything: transportation, food production, industrial output, electricity generation, household costs, and everyday life. Control energy, and you influence the rhythm of entire societies. But energy itself is not independent. It is shaped by geopolitics, alliances, conflicts, sanctions, and strategic decisions made far from the homes they ultimately affect. When political tensions rise, energy markets react. And when energy shifts, the consequences reach everyone, no matter how far they are from the source. So when people think about energy, they usually think locally. The gas station near home, the electricity bill at the end of the month, maybe heating costs in winter. But the truth is much bigger than that. The fuel that powers homes in Europe, factories in Asia, or cars in America often begins its journey thousands of kilometers away. Energy is global, and a relatively small group of countries supplies a large part of the world. Despite all the progress with green energy and alternative energy, oil still drives transportation, aviation, shipping, and much of global industry. And the biggest part of that oil comes from a few key exporters. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iraq, and the United Arab Emirates are among the most important suppliers. The United States, once mostly known as an importer, has also become a major exporter, thanks to the shale boom. And Canada plays a major role, especially in supplying North America. One region alone, the Middle East, accounts for a very large share of global crude oil exports, which is why events there immediately ripple through global markets. Natural gas works differently. Unlike oil, gas needs pipelines or specialized ships carrying liquefied natural gas, LNG. That creates dependency. So, who are the most important gas exporters today? First of all, it's Qatar, one of the world's largest LNG suppliers, shipping huge volumes to both Asia and Europe. It's Australia, a major supplier across the Asia-Pacific region. And of course, the United States, which became the world's largest LNG exporter in recent years, reshaping global energy flows. Other important exporters include Norway, Algeria, and increasingly Azerbaijan, whose supplies gained strategic importance as Europe diversified away from Russian pipeline gas. So here's the part many of us don't realize. Energy markets are connected instantly. A conflict near a pipeline, a sanction on a producing country, or even disruption in one shipping route can raise gasoline prices in American suburbs, increase electricity bills in Europe, and push global food prices higher because transport and fertilizer become more expensive. Energy does not stay where it is produced. It moves through markets and through everyday life. Think of global energy like a bloodstream. The exporting countries are the pumping stations. Pipelines and tanker routes are the arteries. And every economy, even those far from oil fields, depends on that flow staying stable. When the flow changes, everyone feels it. So when something happens in a region that feels distant, a sanction, a conflict, a diplomatic decision, it is not a faraway story. It might already be shaping your electricity bill, your groceries, and the cost of living around you. So let's take a look at what the global energy map looks like today. For nearly 2 decades, Europe's energy system depended heavily on gas from Russia. In 2021, roughly 45% of EU gas imports came from Russia. Russia was also a dominant supplier of oil, providing roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of EU crude oil imports before the war in Ukraine. After the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, sanctions and policy changes triggered one of the largest energy restructurings in modern history. By just a few years later, Russian gas share in EU imports fell from 45% to around 19%. Russian oil imports to the EU collapsed from roughly 27-28% of imports before the crisis to around 3% now, with only a few EU countries still buying Russian crude. The European Union launched plans to eliminate most remaining Russian energy dependence, including a roadmap to stop Russian gas imports entirely by the end of 2027. And this was not a simple market adjustment. It was a geopolitical redesign of global energy flows. Now let's talk a little bit about sanctions. Sanctions were intended to reduce revenue flowing into Russia's energy sector. But energy infrastructure creates inertia. Pipelines built during the Soviet era linked producers, transit countries, and consumers into a single system. Even during conflict, energy systems continue to operate because replacing infrastructure takes time, money, and political agreement. The end of long-lasting transit arrangements symbolized the close of one energy era, but not the end of global dependency. Energy demand does not disappear. It must be replaced. Energy shocks quickly become economic shocks. When gas and oil prices rise, transportation becomes more expensive. Food production costs rise. Manufacturing costs increase. The price of nearly everything moves upward. Energy inflation becomes everyday inflation. This is why energy crises are felt far beyond the countries directly involved. A change in supply routes in Eurasia can influence grocery bills and household budgets across Europe and even indirectly in North America. But there is a quieter consequence: industrial competitiveness. Energy-intensive industries, steel, chemicals, fertilizers, aluminum, depend on predictable and affordable energy. When energy prices rise sharply, factories slow down or relocate, investment decisions shift. Countries with cheaper energy gain an advantage. During the recent energy crisis, energy costs in Europe rose far above those in the United States, strengthening U.S. competitiveness in certain sectors and reshaping industrial strategy debates across the Atlantic. At first glance, this sounds like a regional story. It isn't. As Europe reduced pipeline imports from Russia, it turned toward liquefied natural gas, LNG, much of it supplied by the United States. This changed global trade flows, shipping routes, and energy pricing dynamics. What happens in the Caucasus, Eastern Europe, or the Caspian Sea can influence U.S. energy exports, domestic gas prices, industrial investment, and foreign policy priorities. Energy markets are global. Regional disruptions become global realities. One of the first strategic alternatives after sanctions against Russia intensified came from Azerbaijan. Through the Southern Gas Corridor, a multi-pipeline system linking the Caspian region to Europe, gas supplies expanded just as Europe was searching for diversification. The significance is not only volume, it is route diversity. Every additional corridor means less vulnerability to a single supplier and more strategic flexibility for European policymakers. But Azerbaijan's energy role did not begin recently. In fact, the story starts more than a century ago during one of the world's first oil booms. In the late 19th century, the area around Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, became one of the world's major centers of oil production. By the early 19th, Baku was producing more than half of the world's oil supply, attracting investors, engineers, and industrial pioneers from Europe and beyond. The Nobel brothers, yes, the same family behind the Nobel Prize, built refineries there. Railways, pipelines, and entire industrial districts grew around the oil fields. At that time, Baku was not just producing fuel. It was helping shape the modern global energy industry itself. But history did not move in a straight line. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the newly independent Azerbaijan faced economic instability, war, and severe financial challenges. It was during this difficult period that a decisive strategic move was made. In September 1994, Azerbaijan, under the leadership of Heydar Aliyev, signed what became known as the Agreement of the Century. So basically, it was a production sharing agreement for the development of the Azeri, Chirag, and deepwater Gunashli offshore oil fields in the Caspian Sea. What makes this agreement unique is that it involved 13 international oil companies representing several countries and brought an estimated $7.4 billion in planned investment, one of the largest foreign investment commitments in the post-Soviet space at that time. This was not just an energy deal. It was a strategic decision made at a moment when Azerbaijan's economy was fragile and foreign investment was uncertain. The agreement opened the Caspian Sea to major international energy companies for the first time and signaled that Azerbaijan would pursue integration with global markets rather than isolation. In later years, many analysts and officials described this contract as a turning point, not only because it developed oil fields, but because it helped launch pipelines, infrastructure, and long-term energy diplomacy that still shape the region today. The first oil from this agreement began flowing in 1997, and over time, it laid the foundation for future projects, including the pipelines that would eventually connect the Caspian to global markets. Geography explains much of Azerbaijan's strategic importance. It sits between Europe and Asia, on the western coast of the Caspian Sea, a crossroads between major powers and energy regions. And it has a rare geopolitical feature. Azerbaijan is the only country in the world that shares land borders with both Russia and Iran. That location places it at the meeting point of competing interests, Eurasian, Middle Eastern, and European. Energy routes passing through Azerbaijan connect the Caspian Basin to global markets without crossing Russian or Iranian territory, a fact that became especially significant after Europe began seeking new supply routes. Today, Azerbaijan remains a major energy producer. Offshore fields in the Caspian Sea continue to supply oil and gas through large projects like the Azeri Chirag Gunashli oil complex and the Shah Deniz gas field. The Southern Gas Corridor, which includes the South Caucasus pipeline, Tanap across Turkey and tap into Europe, stretches more than 3,000 kilometers and was designed specifically to diversify European supply routes. First gas reached Europe through this system at the end of 2020, marking a new phase in Eurasian energy integration. For many people in Europe or North America, the South Caucasus can feel distant. But geography turns distance into connection. When one supplier becomes risky, another route suddenly becomes strategic. Azerbaijan's location between Russia, Iran, and Europe means that energy flowing through it helps stabilize broader markets. And stability in energy markets affects everything: electricity prices, industrial competitiveness, inflation, and ultimately household bills far beyond the region itself. And just across Azerbaijan's southern border sits another energy powerhouse, one whose resources are enormous, but whose role in global markets remain limited: Iran. Iran holds some of the largest natural gas reserves in the world, roughly 16% of global proven reserves. On paper, it could be one of the world's major energy exporters, but history and sanctions changed that trajectory. To understand why, we need to go back. The first major turning point came after the 1979 Iranian Revolution. The United States responded with asset freezes and trade restrictions, marking the beginning of decades of economic pressure. Over time, sanctions expanded, especially as concerns grew over Iran's nuclear program. By the mid-2000s, the issue moved to the global stage. So, starting in 2006, the United Nations Security Council adopted several rounds of sanctions against Iran. These targeted nuclear and missile technology, financial transactions, shipping and insurance, and sectors linked to energy development. By 2010, sanctions had intensified significantly, restricting investment and making it harder for Iran to modernize or expand its oil and gas infrastructure. At the same time, the European Union imposed additional measures, including restrictions on oil trade and energy sector equipment. The result was clear: Iran had enormous resources, but limited access to global markets. In 2015, Iran and world powers reached the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The agreement aimed to limit Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. So in 2016, after international verification, many nuclear-related sanctions were lifted. For a brief period, oil exports recovered, foreign companies returned, and global markets began to imagine Iran as a major future supplier. But the opening was short-lived. In 2018, the United States withdrew from the agreement and reimposed major sanctions, especially targeting oil exports and banking. European countries attempted to preserve parts of the deal, but large-scale investments slowed again. Since then, sanctions have evolved, including additional EU and international restrictions tied to regional security and military concerns. The result? Iran remained energy-rich, but heavily constrained in its ability to integrate into global supply systems. This creates one of geopolitics' biggest energy what-ifs, because if sanctions were eased, or political relations changed, Iran could potentially add large volumes of gas and oil to world markets. And that could affect global prices, European energy diversification, and the balance of influence among major exporters. In energy, politics does not just shape supply, it decides who is allowed to supply the world at all. And if Iran represents energy potential shaped by sanctions, just to the east, across the Caspian region, lies another giant that many listeners rarely hear about. Turkmenistan sits in the heart of Central Asia, bordered by Iran to the south, Afghanistan to the southeast, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan to the north, and the Caspian Sea to the west. It is a vast desert nation, geographically close to major energy markets, yet separated from them by distance, terrain, and politics. Turkmenistan holds enormous gas reserves, including some of the largest known fields on Earth. Its proven natural gas reserves are estimated at around 400 trillion cubic feet, placing it among the world's top gas holders. At the center of this wealth lies the Galkanish gas field, widely considered one of the largest gas fields ever discovered. On paper, these numbers suggest a future energy superpower, yet global influence does not always follow geological wealth. In the middle of the Karakum Desert, known for extreme continental temperatures, it features shifting dunes, sparse vegetation, and significant natural gas and oil reserves. There lies one of the most surreal symbols of Turkmenistan's energy story, the Darvaza gas crater, often called the door to hell. Created after a Soviet drilling accident in the early 1970s, the ground collapsed and natural gas ignited. Engineers expected the fire to burn out quickly, but instead it has burned for decades, a permanent flame in the desert fueled by underground gas. It feels like a metaphor for the country itself. Enormous resources, but limited integration into global markets. Today, most Turkmen gas flows east, not west. The main export system connects Turkmenistan to China through the Central Asia-China pipeline network. China has become the dominant buyer, absorbing the majority of Turkmen gas exports. Historically, some gas moved north through older Soviet-era pipelines toward Russia, but those routes declined over time, pushing Turkmenistan to focus on eastern markets. So the obvious question is, if the reserves are so large, why not supply Europe? The answer is geography and infrastructure. Turkmenistan is landlocked. Reaching European markets would require new pipelines, crossing the Caspian Sea, and agreements with multiple neighboring countries. Projects have been discussed for years, but political complexities, financing challenges, and regional negotiations have slowed progress, so most gas continues to flow through routes that already exist. So Turkmenistan's story teaches a simple lesson. Reserves alone are not power. Routes are power. Energy influence depends not only on what lies underground, but on where pipelines go, who controls them, and which markets they can reach. To understand today's energy politics, we have to go back to the time of the Soviet Union. During the Soviet era, energy networks were not designed around independent countries. They were designed around one unified system. Gas fields in what is now Turkmenistan or Russia could feed factories thousands of kilometers away. Oil extracted near the Caspian could travel through pipelines crossing multiple republics before reaching consumers in Europe. Production happened in one republic. Transit passed through another. Consumption took place somewhere else entirely. Borders existed on maps, but economically the system functioned as one organism. The logic was simple: efficiency first. Politics were internal, so transit security was never questioned. No one imagined that one day these internal lines would become international borders. And then came 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed. 15 independent states emerged almost overnight, but pipelines did not move. Steel infrastructure built over decades remained fixed in the ground. And suddenly, energy that once flowed within a single country began crossing sovereign states, each with its own government, interests, and foreign policy. And this changed everything. A pipeline was no longer just an engineering project. It became a strategic asset. Transit countries gained leverage. Producers depended on neighbors to reach markets. Consumers worried about supply interruptions far beyond their borders. Energy transformed from a technical system into a geopolitical negotiation. Disputes over pricing, transit fees, and political alignment began to influence energy flows. Supply disruptions could become diplomatic pressure. Transit routes became tools of influence. And decisions made in one capital could affect heating systems and electricity prices across entire continents. Today, the map is shifting again. Europe diversifies supply. Azerbaijan gains strategic relevance. Russia redirects exports toward Asia. Iran remains a potential giant constrained by sanctions. Turkmenistan waits for new routes and agreements. The United States strengthens its role as a major LNG supplier. The system is not being erased, it's being rewritten. A pipeline laid decades ago can still shape decisions made today. Energy is invisible until it disappears. And that is why events in this region still influence inflation, industrial competitiveness, electricity prices, and foreign policy debates thousands of miles away. Because in the modern world, power does not move only through borders. It moves through flow. This is the end for today. What should we talk about next? Share your ideas and tell us what you think in the comments. Your voice matters here. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed. I'm Irada Hasan, and this is The Global Front.